Do you know the warm progress under the stars? Do you know we exist? Have you forgotten the keys to the kingdom? Have you been born yet, and are you alive? Let's reinvent the gods, all the myths of the ages. Celebrate symbols from deep elder forests. Have you forgotten the lessons of the ancient war? We need great golden copulations. Fathers are cackling in trees of the forest, our mother is dead in the sea. You know we are being led to slaughters by placid admirals, and that fat, slow generals are getting obscene on young blood. You know we are ruled by TV. The moon is a dry blood beast. Guerrilla bands are rolling numbers in the next block of green vine, amassing for warfare on innocent herdsmen who are just dying. O great creator of being, grant us one more hour to perform our art and perfect our lives. The moths and atheists are doubly divine and dying. We live, we die, and death not ends it. Journey we more into the nightmare, cling to life, our passion flower, cling to cunts and cocks of despair. We got our final vision by clap, Columbus's groin got filled with green death. I touched her thigh and death smiled. We have assembled inside this ancient and insane theater to propagate our lust for life and flee the swarming wisdom of the streets. The barns are stormed, the windows kept, and only one of all the rest to dance and save us with the divine mockery of words. Music inflames temperament. True kings' murderers are allowed to roam free. 1,000 magicians arise in the land. Where are the feasts we were promised? Where is the wine, the new wine, dying on the vine?
Okay, here we are again, and you're listening to my podcast number 58, and this is, I think, the third one in the Ripley's Medulla series. So it's been a while, as those of you who have made a habit of being subscribed here and being patient with my delivery of these podcasts. It's been a while, but it's been a long winter here, and it's mainly because winter started very early this year. Plus I have been very busy. I'm now working 11-hour days at work, and we have a new big project in Hermetism, which is taking up a lot of everybody's time, and I'll talk more about that in a later podcast. But for now, I've included a little snippet at the beginning of this video in the introduction section that gives a little bit of a hint to those who are aware of such things about a little bit of where this new project is going. But for now, just before we get started, it is Friday, the 3rd of October already, which means it's very early spring here in New Zealand, and it's a beautiful day already. Already feels like the beginning of summer. Winter wasn't that cold this year, but it looks like we might be in for a long summer as well. And like I said, this is podcast number 58, and we're going to begin a new section of Ripley's Medulla today. So the last podcast I finished up the entire introductory section of the medulla. Anyway, like the previous section, this section on the mineral stone and the philosophic fires is divided into paragraphs that are numbered. So let's begin with the first paragraph of chapter 63. At a time, as I have learned, there was an assembly of philosophers, where the matter of the secret stone and the manner of working it was propounded. Several spoke their opinions, but at length one, younger in years, and, as was thought, inferior in learning, declared his thoughts and knowledge concerning the secret. I know, saith he, the regimens of the fires. When they heard what he could say, they all were amazed and held their peace for a while. So this paragraph starts off, there was a time, as I have learned, that there was an assembly of philosophers. And if you don't know the history of the Western alchemical tradition, you probably are not aware that one of the very first books that came into the West from the Middle East, because that's how alchemy got into Western culture, it came from the Middle East slightly before and during the First Crusades. One of the very first texts that was brought into the West about the subject of alchemy and was translated probably into Latin was a book called the Turba Philosophorum, which we still have copies of today. And Turba Philosophorum is Latin and translates into English as the gathering or meeting of the philosophers. In other words, the book describes a meeting between alchemists who got together to discuss together the process of making the philosopher's stone. So when the opening of this first paragraph says there was an assembly of philosophers, that is a cheeky reference to that first book that came into Western culture on the subject of, one of the first books anyway. It's also arguable that the book of Mauritius was one of the first books, or the first book to come into Western culture from the East on the subject of making the Philosopher's Stone. So, during this meeting of philosophers, one of the youngest guys in that gathering started to talk, and they all believed that because he was young he didn't know anything. But then he claimed to know what Ripley refers to as the regimen of the fires. And we can translate that into more common language as saying he was claiming that he understood the secret teaching, the secret Hermetic teaching about what different fires are used in the acetate path. And they were all, the older guys were all surprised, but they listened to him, and after he had finished speaking, they all fell silent. And then we come to paragraph number 2. At length, one of the company made answer, "If this be true which thou hast said, thou art master over us all." And thereupon, with one consent, they gave him the right hand of fellowship, whereupon they gathered that the secret of this wonderful tincture lay chiefly in the fire. So this is one of the reasons why alchemy is, you'll see it sometimes referred to as the fire philosophy. And that's a term which comes down to us from Zoroastrianism, where they revere fire as the beginning of all things and the manager of nature. It's the fire in things, or the lack of fire in things, which makes those things what they are and allows nature to evolve. And so the older members of that gathering, that turba, all agreed together in one answer. They gathered that the secret of this wonderful tincture, in other words, the key secret of the Philosopher's Stone, lay chiefly in the fire. So it's kind of interesting that those older dudes were still largely ignorant about the secret Hermetic teaching of what the fires are that are used in the process of making the Philosopher's Stone. Paragraph number 3. But it's not just one fire, it differs after several manners. In other words, there are various fires. One is natural, another against nature. The natural fire does come from the influence of Sol and Luna. And if you've listened to my previous podcasts in this series, you'll understand what the code words Sol and Luna refer to. And the asterisms, which is a word which means the influences of the stars, or the sun, moon, and stars. So he's used the code language first, and then he's decrypted it by saying what I refer to is the sun, the moon, and the stars, of which are engendered not only the burning waters and potential vapors of the minerals, in other words, strong corrosive mineral acids, but also the natural virtues of living things. So some of these fires, they're saying, are a natural part of living systems. The unnatural or preternatural fire, is more often called the unnatural fire, is a thing accidental. This is paragraph number 4. As heat in an ague, and ague is an old English term for fever. In other words, there's a fire that's natural to your body, which gets hotter and hotter when you have the ague or a fever. being made artificially. In other words, something kicks that fire off in your body, and called by the philosophers a moist fire, our generating water, the fire of the first degree, and for the temperature of its heat is called a bath, a stew, a dunghill, in which dunghill is made the putrefaction of our stone. In other words, it's a digestive heat. It's the minimal, lowest level of heat that's used during the process of the Philosopher's Stone. And he's telling us some of the cipher languages, cipher terms in the Hermetic language that are used to refer to this first level of temperature. Bath, a stew, a dunghill, in which dunghill is made the putrefaction of our stone, what we would normally call digestion. See section 13 of the former chapter, where it is more amply defined. Paragraph 5, the elemental fire is that which, and in Adam McLean's version of this text on his Alchemy website, which is where I got this from, paragraph 5 reads, the elemental fire is that which does not fix. That's a translation or transcription or typo, because the elemental fire is that which does fix, calcine and burn, and is nourished by combustible things. In other words, elemental fire is fire like you would have in a campfire. It fixes things, it calcines things, it burns things, and is nourished by combustible things. Paragraph 6, the fire against nature, which is a violent, strong, corrosive, destroying the special form of that which is dissolved within it, is that which in power dissolves, frets, infects, and destroys the generative power of the form of the stone. It does dissolve the stone into water of the cloud, with the loss of its natural, attractive and special form, and is called fire against nature, as Raymondus saith, from its operation. For that which fire does make, this fire against nature destroys and brings to corruption, unless there be fire of nature put to it. So this fire against nature is actually what he's describing here, and we know the kind of the key term that he uses to let us know what he's talking about is corrosive. So what he's talking about here is the acids that are made from minerals. Sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, aqua regia are all fires against nature. They're corrosives. And the important thing that he tells us about these acids is that you can't use them by themselves to make the Philosopher's Stone, because they destroy the generative and potent life of the substances that you're using to make the Philosopher's Stone. This is important because there are other paths, like the path of the Regulus of antimony and the path of the Red Dragon, which rely almost entirely on the use of strong mineral acids. And these dudes who follow this way say you can't achieve the Philosopher's Stone by using strong mineral acids, because those acids actually ruin the thing in the substance for making the stone, which is responsible for transmutation and for the life and generative power of the Philosopher's Stone. So that's important. Paragraph 7. Here, as Raymondus saith, lies contrary operations, as in the compounded water. That's a different subject. For as the fire against nature does dissolve the spirit of the fixed body, the volatile spirit is thereby constrained to retire into a fixed earth, a congealed earth as white as snow. So it's a little bit vague what he's saying there, but one of the things that we do know about the fixed earth of metals and minerals is that when you dissolve them in mineral spirits, it cleans the earth and it turns them and purifies it and turns it into like a sugar-like substance. A congealed earth as white as snow. Paragraph 8. For the fire of nature does congeal and dissolve the spirit of the fixed body into a glorious earth. So he's talking about the difference between corrosive acids and the fire of nature, which is the substance that is the product of the pyrolytic distillation of lead acetate. It's what you collect in the receiver, the fire of nature. It is a fluid which contains the sun and the moon and the influences of the stars. But he hasn't told us that that's what the fire of nature is yet. For the fire of nature does congeal the dissolved spirit of the fixed body into a glorious earth, and the body of the volatile being fixed by the same fire against nature is here again by the fire of nature resolved into the water of the philosophers. Getting very technical there, and it's hard to understand because of the vague language, but we'll come back to this. But not into the water of the cloud. And so by this means, the fixed is returned back into its wanted nature of flying or volatile, and the moist is made dry, and the ponderous is made light. So he's kind of, I won't go into in detail yet because he'll describe it during this chapter in detail, but basically he's hinting that you can mix the substance in the receiver from pyrolytic distillation of lead acetate with corrosive metals, and by doing this it doesn't destroy the life or the generative power of the substance that you use to make the stone. And Raymond Lully referred to this substance as his compound water. But yet he saith, and he's referring again to Raymond Lully, this fire which is against nature is not the work of our magistry. In other words, you can't just use those mineral acids to make the philosopher's stone, but it is the fire which is purely natural, full stop. In other words, the fire that we use to make our magistry or philosopher's stone is purely natural. In other words, it's the product of pyrolytic distillation. This he saith, because he would show us thereby the difference between the mineral elixir and the vegetable. So that's what I said before we started reading this, that we're talking about two different ways of making the stone. It's the same kind of process, but you're using acetic acid in one process and using mineral acids in the other process. And now he'll add the animal. And we'll get to that when we get to the chapter on the animal stone. For that these three several waters, the mineral, the vegetable, and the animal, which serve for the work divers ways. In other words, now he's teaching us very subtly that the difference between the various paths, the vegetable, the mineral, and the animal, is all about the solvent that's used. And that these solvents are used for the work divers ways. And divers is an old English term for many or various different ways. So in other words, these solvents, mineral, vegetable, animal, have different effects on the matter for the philosopher's stone. If you don't know all that, you can't do the work properly because you'll screw everything up. And first we will treat of the mineral elixir, then of the other in order. The fire against nature, viz. The humour or tincture drawn out of the body of Venus, dissolved in its mineral spirit. And you have to be a bit of a chemist to understand what's being talked about there. The body of Venus means the body of copper. That's a Kabbalistic cipher. If anyone doubts that the alchemists studied Kabbalah and understood the same things we learn about Kabbalah as modern occultists, there's the proof there. A tincture is drawn out of the body of Venus, dissolved in its own mineral spirit. So he's actually talking about vitriol, Roman vitriol there. When you distill it, when you dry distill it, that's where you get sulfuric acid from, which is the beginning, back in those days, of the ways in which you also made hydrochloric acid and nitric acid and aqua regia. You first need sulfuric acid. Very strong and mortal. So sulfuric acid is a very strong acid, and when he says it's mortal, it's not a spiritual thing. So it's not about the Philosopher's Stone. It's a materialist, mechanical tool to be used in the work, serving only to the mineral elixir. In other words, it's only used to make the mineral stone. This mineral water, or fire against nature, so there we go, he's now made it clear for us that the fire against nature is this mineral water, in other words, sulfuric acid, is drawn fire elemental. Somebody's missed a word there, is drawn out by the fire elemental. In other words, you get Roman vitriol, you ground it down to powder, then you basically burn it. And you get a fume off, and that fume is sulfuric acid. From a certain stinking menstruum, as Raymundus saith, and is made of 4 things. It is the strongest water in the world. That's not entirely true, because they knew of aqua regia, which was stronger than sulfuric acid. Whose only spirit, saith he, does wonderfully increase and multiply the tincture of the ferment. So you've got to use sulfuric acid to make the ferment for the acetate path. And here, soul or gold is tinged with the mineral spirit. There you go, he's just said it right there. The which mineral spirit is the strength of the most simple sulfur without much earthiness. So in other words, to make the ferment for the Philosopher's Stone from gold or silver, you first have to prepare the salt of gold or silver by dissolving it in sulfuric acid. Paragraph 12. Thin mineral water is the dropping of Adrop or Adrop Venus, which is the noble tincture called the natural Roman vitriol, and which for the abundance of its noble tincture is called Roman gold. Now, he's deliberately toying around a trick of words which confused a lot of people in the past, where they got the process for the making of sulfuric acid confused with the process of lead acetate pyrolytic distillation. He's bringing in that confusion by using the words adrop or adrup and Venus, which are terms that we use in the pyrolytic distillation of lead acetate. But Roman vitriol, he also says. So he's talking about sulfuric acid,, and, copper vitriol. mixing up those terms to create confusion. Paragraph 13. This some do call the spirit of the green lion, in other words, the distillate which comes out of lead acetate. Others, the blood of the green lion, wherein almost all err and are deceived. For the green lion of the philosophers is that lion by whose virtue attractive, magnetic, all things are lifted up from the bowels of the earth and the winter-like caverns, making them to wax green and flourish, whose child, for all the elixirs can be had from it, is to us most acceptable and sufficient. So he's kind of hinting there about this confusion between the copper process for making sulfuric acid and the lead acetate process for making Ripley's blessed water, the blood of the green lion. Paragraph number 14. The child of the philosophers is generated of their green lion. And the child of the philosophers is the philosopher's stone. We give birth to the philosopher's stone, of which child is had the strength of sulphur, both white and red. And by now you should know what he's referring to there. Our two sulphurs of nature are the gold and silver of the philosophers and their hidden treasures. So these are the two fumes of pyrolytic distillation. He's going back to talking about that now. Paragraph 15. Of this child of the green lion of the philosophers is drawn the strength of sulphur, white and red, but not burning or not corrosive, as Avicennius saith, which are the two best things the alchemist can take to make his gold and silver of. In other words, the two fumes from pyrolytic distillation, the two best things that you can get in order to make a stone that will allow you to produce gold and silver. And this is sufficient to be said for the attaining the knowledge of the green lion, which is so called because that when he is dissolved, he is straightways adorned with a green vestiture. In other words, when you dissolve lead oxide in acetic acid, you get a green tincture. So he's telling us that that's where the name green lion comes from. I.e., when our sulphur of nature is dissolved in its own menstruum, which is the virgin's milk, it is clothed with this greenness and therefore called the green lion. Now he's switched up there and he's referred to a later process in the work. He's talking about two separate things there. That when we take the virgin's milk, lac virginius, and dissolve the sulphur of nature in it, you get a green tincture. And I produced a picture of this in my first book, Hermes Paradigm, Book 1. Paragraph 15-16. But of the green lion of fools, in other words, there's another kind of green lion, which true alchemists call the green lion of the fools, this we say, that from it, with a strong fire, is drawn aqua fortes. So the green lion of fools is Roman vitriol, copper vitriol, in the which the aforesaid philosopher's lion of the mineral stone ought to be elixirated. In other words, you need to use sulfuric acid when you're making the mineral stone, to elixirate or turn into a medicine the substance of the stone, and assumes its name therefrom. Raymundus saith, it were better or safer to eat the eyes of a basilisk, which is a mythological creature, about which it said if a basilisk looks at you, or you look into the eyes of a basilisk, you'll turn to stone or die or something, than to eat that gold. In other words, to eat gold or the elixir that's made by the mineral path. You'd be better off eating the eyes of a basilisk than to ingest the products of the mineral stone, which is made with the fire against nature. Paragraph 17, and I say also that the things from whence the same aqua fortes is drawn is green vitriol and azoth, i.e. vitriol natural, not artificial, viz. The droppings of copper, that's copper vitriol, called also Roman vitriol or Roman gold by many of the philosophers, from the abundance of its noble tincture, the which tincture must be fermented with gold. So he's deliberately swapping back and forward between ideas there, but dropping in a big secret that hasn't been mentioned before, and which most other alchemists in their texts never talked about, and that is how to make the ferment of gold. And the first step is to dissolve the salt of gold in aqua fortes, the tincture of Roman vitriol, sulfuric acid. Paragraph 18, how great and secret a virtue then, and of what strength the fire against nature is, evidently appears in the construction of the body of the volatile spirit, being by it vulgarly sublimed in the form of a snowy whiteness. Raymundus, in the end of the epistle of his abridgment, saith, feed argent vive with this oil, viz. with the oil wherewith the spirit of the quintessence is thickened, etc. I'm not going to go into exactly what that means yet, because we're going to get onto it later. And I think this is the last paragraph in this section. Yep. Paragraph 19. For want of such natural vitriol, the true and natural principle, not artificial, as Vincent saith, made of salts, sulphurs, and alums, which cut and gnaw metals, is to be chosen, lest in the end of your work you will fail of your desire. The philosophers will you to calcine gold with mercury crude, till it be brought into a calx red as blood. Here comes in the work of soul and mercury together, brought into a dry red powder and fixed. But whether it is to be done with mercury or sulphur, the water of him is doubtful. So he's talking there about the calcination of the salt of gold into a red salt using crude mercury. In other words, there's a way of using the running mercury metal to purify gold. And he's just said there in that last paragraph that he's not sure whether Raymond Lully meant to use the running mercury of gold to purify your salt of gold to make the ferment, or whether to use sulphur. In other words, sulfuric acid. Okay, so after that long break, That's an entire chapter by itself, and there's plenty to think about there. He's kind of roughly laid down the rules for what the mineral stone is, that it's going to be used, it's going to be made by using sulfuric acid as one of its main tools or ingredients of work, and that it's dangerous to ingest the products of the stone. It won't make the elixir of life because it's highly toxic, because as soon as you mix the substances that you make the stone from with mineral acids, those acids alter chemically and esoterically alter those substances in such a way that they become toxic and they lose their generative potency. So after a big break, I think that's enough. With any luck now, we're on the edge of summer, which means that I will be back out camping soon. I've been spending a lot of the winter buying some new camping gear, and I've got to get my canoe cleaned up and ready for the season, and it looks like it's going to be a good season. I much prefer to film on the lake or at a campground because it's quieter. It's getting noisier and noisier now in the city, and it's very unreliable to video. So it's much easier, especially for long form videos, to film them in the canoe, because in the canoe, early in the morning, just after sunrise, when it's dead quiet, still on the water, I know there's going to be no barking dogs, no garden machinery, and so forth. Also, I'll point out again that item that I included in the introduction to this video, there's another item similar to it coming in the outro, and there will be 20 more of these coming up in the future videos. If you've managed to stay through to the end of this video, thanks for watching. For those of you who have been subscribers to the channel for a long while, thank you for being patient since you're still here. If you're watching this, try and make shorter gaps between the videos from now. I know I've said that in the past, but it's always my intention to make the videos closer together. And we'll see you in the next episode of this series.
Do you know the warm progress under the stars? Do you know we exist? Have you forgotten the keys to the kingdom? Have you been born yet, and are you alive? Let's reinvent the gods, all the myths of the ages. Celebrate symbols from deep elder forests. Have you forgotten the lessons of the ancient war? We need great golden copulations. The fathers are cackling in trees of the forest. Our mother is dead in the sea. You know we are being led to slaughters by placid admirals, and that fat, slow generals are getting obscene on young blood. You know we are ruled by TV. The moon is a dry blood beast. Guerrilla bands are rolling numbers in the next block of green vine, amassing for warfare on innocent herdsmen who are just dying. O great creator of being, grant us one more hour to perform our art and perfect our lives. The moths and atheists are doubly divine and dying. We live, we die, and death not ends it. Journey we more into the nightmare, cling to life, our passion flower, cling to cunts and cocks of despair. We got our final vision by clap. Columbus's groin got filled with green death. I touched her thigh and death smiled.